Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to deep dive in Azure Networking. Private links, service endpoint, dedicated instances, NAT gateways, site to site, ExpressRoute, network pairing. If you are the one who is new to all these Azure networking concepts, or you know some concepts but hard to tell the differences, I'll explain here in simple words. Azure Virtual Network or VNet is in the center of all the network communication, may it be a communication between the subnet and the connected resources, or between the VNet and the connected Azure PaaS services, or connection to the on-prem, or to the other virtual network, or to the internet. And because virtual network is common for all these connections, hence the definition of the virtual network is Azure Virtual Network is a service that provides the fundamental building block for your private network in Azure. An instance of a service, that is, a virtual network, enables many types of Azure resources to securely communicate with each other, the internet, and your on-prem network. Now let's first talk about our first communication quickly, that is, between Azure Subnet and the connected resources. Resources within the virtual network and the subnet can communicate with each other privately through private IP addresses. Custom application servers, which are installed in various Azure services like virtual machine skill set, or in Azure Kubernetes, or in Azure Function. But how many of these services can connect to the VNet? There are around 35 services to which VNet connects, which are divided into various categories. These instances are called as dedicated instances which are attached to the VNet. But how are these Azure services attached itself to VNet? Let's take an example of network category, an application gateway service. When we create application gateway services from portal or any other way, we can configure virtual network as you can see here. This way we provide virtual network and the subnet during the creation, and it attaches itself to the VNet. Let's take one more example of Azure Kubernetes service. As you see, similar to the application gateway service, during creation of the AKS, we can provide a specific virtual network as well as the cluster subnet. This way, we can assign a dedicated Azure service to the VNet. So now, we know how to attach a dedicated PaaS service to the virtual network. But is it the only way to connect the Azure PaaS service? Answer is no. Let's understand all the ways to connect to the Azure PaaS service. The first way we have already covered, that is, deploying a dedicated instance of the service to the virtual network. The entire list of 35 services dedicated instances can be deployed to VNet. The second way to communicate to the Azure service is to use the Azure Private Link to privately access a specific instance of a service from your virtual network. Let's deep dive to understand more about the Azure Private Link. How to create a private link? Hands-on demo I've already created. You can find out above in the I button, and I'll also share the link in the description. Let's continue. Azure Private Link provides private connectivity from a virtual network to Azure PaaS service, customer-owned service, or Microsoft partner service. As you can see in the diagram, we are connecting to the Azure PaaS service using the private link and using the services private endpoint to connect. And no public access is required. All the traffic to the service can be routed through the private endpoint. So no gateways, NAT devices, ExpressRoute, VPN connection, or public IP is required. Private link keep the traffic on the Microsoft global network, usually called as Azure Backbone Network. So now we know two ways to connect to the Azure PaaS service. What is the third one? Can you guess? Yes, it is service endpoint, extending a virtual network to the service through service endpoint. Let's check the service endpoint in detail. How to create a service endpoint? Hands-on demo I've already created. You can find out above in the I button, and I'll also share the link in the description. With service endpoint, the PaaS service is still separate to your VNet, and the traffic is leaving your virtual network to access the PaaS service over the optimized route over Azure Backbone Network. There are two steps to enable service endpoint. Service endpoint works by enabling a subnet or subnets on your virtual network to support a service endpoint. Once this is done, you can configure your PaaS resource to only accept traffic from that particular subnet. Important thing to note here is service endpoint cannot be used by traffic originating from the on-prem through VPN or ExpressRoute. Only traffic coming from the Azure Virtual Network can use it. As Service Endpoint can enable access to all instances of certain type of PaaS service, a Service Endpoint policy configuration allows or deny traffic from a specific virtual network to a specific PaaS resource. It can be used to control the access to PaaS resources over the Service Endpoint. Now we know about both interesting ways to communicate to PaaS service, but what are their differences? Let's check. First factor is scope. Service Endpoint, once enabled, then it provides access to all the instances of the services. Let's consider you have many storage account and you enable Service Endpoint to storage account service. Then all the storage account will be accessible from the virtual network subnet. To control a specific instance, we can use the Service Endpoint policy though, whereas by default, Private Link enables access to specific instances of Azure PaaS service, and each PaaS service will have dedicated private endpoint to connect. Next factor to compare is connectivity. In Service Endpoint, public IP of the PaaS service is used to connect. The traffic between the VNet and the public IP of the service goes over the Azure backbone network. In Private Link, Azure PaaS service receives a private IP from the VNet used to communicate with your VNet. Next is On-Prem Connectivity. For Service Endpoint, we cannot connect it from on-prem, only from the Azure VNet, whereas Private Link offers connectivity to on-prem to PaaS service using the ExpressRoute or VPN tunneling. The last factor, but very important to choose a service for your requirement, is cost. The Service Endpoint is free to use, whereas the Private Link cost is based on the inbound and the outbound traffic and the number of endpoints. Your traffic grows, your cost grows. I believe now you understand the difference between the two ways of communication and you can smartly choose one based on your requirement. Let's now move to what are the various ways to connect on-prem resources to Azure VNet. Let's deep dive in. The first approach is point-to-site virtual private network. This connection is established between the virtual network and a single computer in your on-prem network. So if you want to connect one computer, this type of connection is preferred. The communication is sent through the encrypted tunnel over the internet. Second approach is site-to-site virtual private network. This connection is between on-premises VPN device and your Azure VPN gateway that is deployed in the VNet. So this kind of communication is used to connect multiple on-prem devices connected to the on-prem network to the VNet network. The communication is sent through an encrypted tunnel over the internet. The third way of communication to on-prem is Azure ExpressRoute. Here, the connection is again for multiple on-prem devices in your network and the Azure network through the ExpressRoute partner. There are many ExpressRoute partners in the market which you can select and use. This connection is private. Traffic does not go over the internet, whereas in point-to-site and site-to-site, it is over the internet through an encrypted tunnel. So now we know three different ways to connect to on-prem. Let's now move to another interesting way of communication between VNet to VNet. Let's consider you have two or more different VNets in Azure. There are different services connected to it, and it is your job to enable communication between these services. What are your options? It is virtual network peering, which allows you to connect virtual network to each other by using VNet peering. Once you establish this communication, resources in either virtual network can then communicate with each other. The virtual network that you connect can be in same or different Azure regions. After VNet to VNet communication, let's move to our next communication with internet. Here, we'll deep dive in what are the different offerings for inbound and outbound connection to the internet. Let's focus on inbound traffic and what are the ways to connect. First, And the simplest way is assigning a public IP address to your resource. This way, you can directly connect to a resource or a service and send traffic to it. Second way is using public load balancer. A public load balancer maps public IP and the port of incoming traffic to the private IP and the port of maybe a VM. You can distribute specific type of traffic across multiple VMs or services by applying load balancer rules. Now let's check ways to connect the outbound internet traffic. By default, all the resources in the virtual network can communicate outbound with the internet. Assigning a public IP address to a specific resource is another way. Or you can use network address translation, that is NAT Gateway service for inbound communication. You can use Azure NAT Gateway to let all the instances in the private subnet connect to outbound to the internet while remaining fully private. By default, the inbound connection from the internet are not permitted through a NAT gateway. Next option for the outbound internet connection is public load balancer. A public load balancer can provide outbound connections for virtual machines inside your virtual network. These connections are accomplished by translating their private IP addresses to the public IP addresses. If you have only internal standard load balancer, you need to define outbound connection with an instance level public IP address or a public load balancer. I believe now you understand different ways of communication and ways to do it with Azure Network. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content.